Good morning. I'm Jim DeMent from South Carolina. Let me give you a little context of our welfare reform. As all of you know, the nation's attention right now is on the super committee and the need to cut spending to get our debt under control. But it doesn't seem they're looking in the right places. It's clear that spending has increased dramatically over the last few years. One of those areas is means-tested welfare. There are over 70 programs that have increased. If you look at 2 decades, about 300% actually, 292%, which is more than the combined growth of Medicare and Medicaid, more than the growth of education, more than the growth of defense spending. And in just the last, just since 2008, if we returned welfare spending to 2008 levels, pre-2008 when President Obama took office, over the next 10 years, we could save $2.4 trillion. As this super committee is starting, as we hear, to use gimmicks to find just nominal savings, we're forgetting the fact that the reason our country is in such huge debt is that our spending has increased dramatically. So before we take more money from hardworking American taxpayers, let's look at where spending has increased and see if there are ways that we can cut back. America can no longer afford to continue to do the wrong things with borrowed money. And as we focus on our welfare system, we have to accept the fact that we have not solved the problem. We've discouraged self-sufficiency, and we have more people in poverty now than we did 10 years ago. And what we need to do is redirect these programs in a way that encourage states to promote self-sufficiency, put caps on spending, and to make sure that what we're doing is helping those in need and encouraging them to move away from government dependency into self-sufficiency. What we do with this bill is we put spending caps on all means-tested welfare spending at the 2007 levels, and then it's indexed for inflation. It would be effective 2015 or when unemployment falls below 7.5%. And we would enforce these caps with a budget resolution, and as I mentioned, we would save over a 10-year period $2.4 trillion. And again, keep in mind, what we're not talking about going in and drastically cutting programs. We're returning to pre-stimulus levels. We're taking out that some of the 13.6% increase in food stamps that came from the president's stimulus plan. But in the food stamp program alone, we have doubled the spending from $40 billion to nearly $80 billion in this year's appropriation bills. And there are rampant reports of fraud and problems we have in the system. So for someone to say that we can't go into this program, restore some sanity and spending caps to 2008 levels makes absolutely no sense. So that's what we're doing today, is to interject into the national conversation some real responsibility at the federal level, something that would actually help the poor develop their skills. We've got $300 million in here that we redirect to the states to help promote self-sufficiency and training to put people back to work. So instead of coming up with gimmicks to save money at the federal level right now, we need to look at programs that aren't working, make them work right, and cut back the spending to reasonable levels. So now I'll turn it over to my colleagues who are supporting me in this effort.
Thanks, Jim, and I'm very, very pleased to join these co-authors in this welfare reform effort. You know, in the whole debt debate, there is a pretty wide acknowledgement that the biggest problem is so-called mandatory spending or entitlement programs. But there's hardly any mention of the biggest example of that, which is means-tested welfare programs. And in fact, as Jim has said, that spending has increased at a much greater rate the last couple of decades, even compared to Medicare and Social Security. So that spending has really ramped up, even compared to Medicare and Social Security, and of course at a much, much higher rate than discretionary programs like education or defense. We had significant and meaningful welfare reform in 1995, but it was one program only, one of 77, and we're due for another installment of positive welfare reform, particularly in the midst of this debt crisis. Another thing, as Jim mentioned, positive thing that this bill would do would have us focus on the total amount of means-tested welfare programs there are. There are 77 different programs. So one important thing this bill would do would coalesce those in terms of reporting so we can actually track that overall growth in spending rather than it being essentially hidden in 77 different line items of the federal budget. So I think this is very important for the folks who the program is designed to benefit and for our fiscal situation, which is why I'm happy to be an original co-author. Mike?
Even and especially those who support welfare at the federal level should be excited about this proposal, or should at least demand either this proposal or another proposal be brought forward and eventually passed by Congress. The reason is the rate at which we're currently spending is such that we will, by the end of this decade, according to the Obama White House, which made this projection early this year, incur interest costs that will be somewhere in the range of $1 trillion every single year. This is a result of spending projections influenced, among other things, by mandatory spending, like the items that we're dealing with here. Now let's think about what that does for a minute. When we reach the point, which may be a decade away, maybe a little bit sooner than that, once we reach that point, we'll be spending between $700 and $800 billion a year more on interest than we're currently spending. In other words, we'll be spending more in new additional interest that we're not having to pay today than we're currently spending on these means-tested entitlement programs, which is roughly $700 billion. That money has to come from somewhere. We have to make up that difference somewhere. We can't just borrow more money at that point, or else our interest rate will go up even higher. Our yield rates on U.S. Treasury instruments will go up even further and further compound this same problem. So not doing anything isn't really an option. The best way to kill these programs and every other federal program out there is to do nothing, allow them to continue to operate on autopilot, just as our interest payments gradually cripple our ability to fund everything from entitlements to defense. That is a problem, and that's why we're doing something about it. So I thank Senator DeMint and Senator Vitter and the others who have shown such leadership on this issue, and particularly commend Senator DeMint for authoring and introducing this, and I'm pleased to join him.
Just one other comment, and I want to take your questions. This super committee is considering cutting Medicare and Social Security. Benefits that have been paid for by seniors. But they're not considering modernizing and looking at the real spending that's coming from these 77 welfare programs. It makes no sense right now that we're not even considering programs that have been increased so dramatically over the last few years to the detriment of the people we're trying to help. So this is an idea, again, we want to interject into the debate and just ask why. Why aren't both parties looking at the whole means-tested welfare system to see if we can make this work better, give states more flexibility, more incentive, but cap the spending at reasonable levels? And it's one area of our budget that we can control. But as Senator Vitter said, we're often, in some of these appropriation bills that are going through now above last year's level, the excuse given is, oh, a lot of this is mandatory spending, as if we had no control over it. A lot of these means-tested programs are what we consider mandatory spending, and we could change them by passing this bill here today.